the demands for police reform, the concerns about racial injustice, and we focus so often on what's going on nationally, but the same is going on right here in Austin, Texas, in Travis County. And our speaker today is the most knowledgeable person I know from having lived it on the inside, but as a distinguished lawyer, but also one of our real authorities politically. I'm really honored to introduce my dear friend, Wayne Meissner. Wayne is one of the most notable criminal defense attorneys in Texas, but he's also noted for his work in areas involving environmental issues, financial institutions, and as I say, a very noted political authority. And things have kind of turned upside down, as reflected even by some of our recent elections. And I'm delighted that Wayne, who is a lawyer of significant experience, he was a prosecutor of both misdemeanor and felony cases prior to a 50-year law practice, which he still continues very successfully. And Wayne, it's a real honor to have you, and thank you for having the time to join us today.
Good afternoon, Lions. It's a privilege to be here with you, and I'm going to run through a few things that sort of have guided my professional life for the last 50 plus years, and then invite all of your questions. And I think it's appropriate right off that we're acknowledging the dropping of the bombs on Japan. We fought a lot of wars in this country, and in the Pledge of Allegiance that we start off with here, we pledge to honor liberty and justice for all. My concern throughout my entire life is who are all. In the Constitution of the United States of America that we continue to honor and prize, we talk about inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence and in at least the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. We talk about due process, privileges and immunities, and equal protection. We've been fighting all that for how long now to try to figure out who's entitled to equal protection. We are still, even here in Travis County, in my judgment, fighting the results of the Civil War. If it wasn't for the 7 deadly sins, I probably wouldn't have a whole lot of work to do. One of the primary among those is greed. Just straight up all-American greed that keeps me busy with people lying, cheating, and stealing. From the corporate boardroom to kids in middle school. But when you add on top of all of that, a little bit of sex, alcohol, drugs, weapons, mental health issues, and now this god-awful pandemic, I can't work myself out of a job. The population around here, as you all know, because all of you are over 30, you've seen the population explode here within the last 20 years. I credit some of that, or perhaps even blame it, on my good friend Pike Powers, who together with George Kosmetsky at the university, helped develop one of the first high-tech conglomerates here in town called MCC, Microelectronics Consortium, that was headed up by Admiral Bobby Inman. That morphed later on into Sematech, and Austin became and continues to emerge as a high-tech hub in the universe. That brings a lot of different people to town. It creates a lot of jobs. But I still go back to the notion that some of the wars we've been fighting have had an effect on the local, I guess, population. And I'll tell you how that is. In my line of work, we're in a reactive mode. I precious seldom precious seldom, get to give anybody any advice proactively on what they learned when they were 7 years old. And that is, honor your mama and stay out of trouble. The reactive mode is that something bad has already happened by the time I get involved. Nobody ever calls me and says, Meissner, would it be okay if I shoot my wife's boyfriend? Or Meissner, would it be okay if I haul a load of cocaine from Laredo to Dallas? It's already happened, folks. Somebody's in the hospital, somebody's in jail, somebody might be going to the cemetery. And what we're left with is that constitutional framework that we honor and call due process. That if we're going to prosecute folks, my prayer is that it would be done according to some respected and complied with rules. Rules. That doesn't mean I have to like everybody I work for. And that doesn't mean I have to work for everybody. But the plain fact is, when they finally come for me, I want there to be somebody to represent me according to a set of rules. And not just bring in that guilty German Meissner and then give him a fair trial after we decide that he's already guilty. You see from my printout and the flyer that y'all received, I grew up down in Victoria County, and my German ancestors got off a boat in Indianola down there by Port Lavaca. They made their way inland to Victoria County. And Victoria County was and still is a pretty diverse neighborhood. That doesn't mean it was always fair. It was always pretty diverse though. Lots of Germans, lots of Italians, lots of folks from Lebanon, lots of Irish. I don't know how people decided who was going to get the land down there in those days, but I'm pretty sure they took it away from the Native Americans and the Mexicans. There are still people who will fight you to the death right now if you try to tell them that the Mexicans built the Alamo. So we're still fighting so many of those racial issues and power issues on so many levels that continue to play out even in our community right here in Austin. So how all of that gets to moving forward at the courthouse starts with several components. There are several moving parts to what we call the criminal justice system and perhaps broadly law enforcement. Law enforcement means of course, your local Austin Police Department and the Travis County Sheriff's Office. But inside the boundaries of Travis County, you've got multiple, that are what I refer to as fiefdoms. The city of Pflugerville has their own police department. Round Rock has their own police department. Lakeway has their own police department. Westlake, Rolling Wood, Bee Cave, Mustang Ridge, Buda. And they all have to kind of communicate with the prosecutors. The first line of that criminal justice system generally is the law enforcement folks who are invited to get involved in what I call other people's drama. Somebody is lying, cheating, stealing, or beating up on each other or hurting somebody, and law enforcement gets involved and they have to generate their reports and try to figure out what happened. And then they wrap all that up and tie a ribbon around it and send it up to the courthouse to the prosecutors. We have had what I think is a real good prosecution office around here for a whole lot of my professional life. Ronnie Earl and I started law school the same day in 1964. And I'm sorry to say that he has now gone on to his reward, but I thought Ronnie did as good a job as could be done in managing criminal prosecution in Travis County on the felony level. We've had a succession of county attorneys who did a pretty good job in misdemeanor prosecution and in advising the commissioner's court and the county judges we've had on how to manage the business of the county. But traditionally, the citizens of Travis County get the kind of law enforcement that they're prepared to pay for. And y'all know, because you're smart about this and you're engaged and you're active, that the City of Austin Police Department has developed one of the stronger unions, public unions in the country. They take pretty good care of themselves in the context of the civil service framework, as well as the ability to represent the members before the city council and generate what I call a pretty generous pay compensation system for Austin police folks. Now, when they send that information over to the prosecutors, the district attorney and the county attorney have to review all of those reports and make some decisions about how and whether or not to move forward. They've got to figure out what facts they can present to prove somebody guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's just a traditional role. Y'all know from your engagement in the community that there have been so many different variations of how to reasonably resolve a criminal dispute that it's sometimes hard to keep up with all of the deferred and, I guess, alternative forms of resolution. There's a community service function that got started because there were a lot of folks who couldn't pay a fine, and the judge told them in those days, 40 years ago, if you will go do some volunteer work for somebody, I'll give you credit for your fine. That has morphed into a mandatory community service program that is a component to every probation sentence that is handed out in the misdemeanor and the felony courts. And that's just one way to resolve a matter. There are alternative resolution programs because we now have a veterans court, we have a dedicated family violence court, we have a dedicated drug court, we have a dedicated DWI court. All of those folks are funneled through some recovery and restitution and reconciliation program that hopefully keeps them from coming back to the courthouse. That's, of course, the prayer. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't work out so good. But when the felony matters are presented to the prosecutors, under the Constitution and the laws of our state, they have to funnel that through a grand jury. Surely y'all all understand what that means, but I'm going to tell you right quick. That's a selected group of folks who screen. They're supposed to be the buffer between the government and the citizens. They're screening those accusations to see if there really is enough information to move forward to the trial courts. So the grand juries vote to indict people, to formally accuse them, primarily in felony cases. The county attorneys are the ones who generally get to make the decision to file a misdemeanor charge, and most of those involve alcohol and misdemeanor low-level assaults, and now, of course, family violence cases. They used to file a lot of hot check cases, but they quit doing that and told the merchants, y'all have to figure out on your own how to collect your bad debts. But the felonies have to be presented to the grand jury. My concern about that grand jury process is that it has, in my view, developed over the years that the grand jurors feel like they work for the district attorney's office because they are, as soon as they're sworn in by a district judge, they are turned over to a group of felony prosecutors, and they are marshaled back to the district attorney's office suite, and they have their own meeting rooms in the complex where the district attorneys are located. I don't know how they generally ever decide not to indict somebody when the prosecutors ask them to do it. That's just one modern kind of moderate concern. But when the grand jury returns an accusation, that moves the matter into the trial courts. We have a number of, I guess I'd say, qualified, competent, experienced trial judges here in Travis County, and they have been pretty good to work with for 50 years. The transitions that we see over the years is that more and more women, and I'm happy to tell you, are being active and are participating in the legal profession. When I was in school, seemed like 100 years ago, Gaylord, there were 5 women in our graduating class in 1967. Now, my perception is there are more than 50% women in the law school graduating classes. Just like is true in my Aggie Veterinary Wife's College of Veterinary Medicine over there at Texas A&M. There are more women than men graduating from veterinary school. So I'm happy to see that the women not only have a voice, but have a participation and are engaged in the criminal justice system. Now with this corona outrage, we are put on the back burner at our courthouse, and y'all know it's been shut down for months. No jury trials are taking place, and that means that none of you are going to have to go to the courthouse and listen to me ask you where you're from and what you do and why do you want to be on this jury. There won't be any jury trials in Travis County in the near future, I don't think. But we do have trial courts, and mercifully, we still have the Constitution where you're entitled to have a trial by a jury. You're entitled to put on witnesses for yourself. As your lawyer, I get to cross-examine whatever government witnesses are presented, and then 12 jurors in felony cases get to decide whether people are guilty or not guilty, and in some cases, what to do with them after that. That's how that system works. In the law enforcement component, some of you are old enough to know and remember from your own military experience that several perhaps of your brothers, not so much your sisters in those days, but your brothers from the military, when they got out of the uniform and were looking for work, they recycled into local law enforcement. Somebody smarter than I am many years ago said that military justice is to justice what military music is to music. It can be a little bit harsh from time to time. So some of the guys who are trained in small arms fire, in rocket fire, in cannon fire, have recycled into local law enforcement, and now you see them on our streets in full combat ready preparation gear. It breaks my heart to know that that's where we've come to here in America and here in Austin, Texas. But there are so many other influences out there in the universe that are out of our control. We don't always get to vote on it. We don't always get to manage how it unfolds, but it has been unfolding for so many years that there is now in our town and all over the country and all over the world a significant pushback to what people perceive, and in so many cases, rightfully so, that they're not really getting to enjoy the fruits of that liberty and justice for all. They're not really getting to enjoy equal protection under the law. They're not enjoying, I guess it's easy to say for me, they're not getting to enjoy equal education opportunities. They're not getting to enjoy inheritance from their ancestors because their ancestors were deprived of everything. And they unfortunately are subjected to decisions that were made a long time ago that we're still living with. Just one simple one here in Travis County was the master plan of some years ago that pretty much relegated Black and brown people to the other side of East Avenue and made it easier to segregate people on the other side of what was then the interregional highway when I came to school here and became Interstate 35. Now the demographics are shifting some, and there is a concept called gentrification that is pretty painful to a lot of people. And so there are people in the streets marching. I don't think any of you, and I certainly don't condone violence, but I can appreciate why somebody would want to really express themselves in a lot of different ways. And then, of course, y'all know from your own experience, there are some troublemakers who are going to stir up violence just for the sake of stirring up violence and pitting people against each other for the wrong reasons. We see some of that come through the courthouse. We have to deal with it. Law enforcement has to deal with it. Being a good cop is no sense. And if anybody tells you that criminal defense lawyers are anti-cop, they're lying to you, and they've got an unfortunate bias about the matter, because I spent most of my life here in Austin. I've raised 2 sets of kids. I'm interested in good law enforcement. I am not interested in bad law enforcement, and I don't think you folks are either. But the population has shifted a good bit in Travis County. The high-tech operations have brought a lot of young people who I've said to others, they're kind of addicted to their screens, and I don't know how strong their thumbs are, but I'm not going to thumb wrestle any of them. They're smart, they're tech savvy, and they know what's going on around the world. When you and I grew up, we got to learn about it perhaps on the Huntley-Brinkley report. We got to hear about it from several different networks, and now you can't keep up with all of the services that are available to give you instant information instantly. There is I guess an overabundance of instant information based on instant communication, which also leads a lot of people to instant gratification and instant disposability. I want to know about the latest thing. I want to use it up. I want to move on to something else. And all of that high-tech activity is moving through the internet at warp speed. Somebody smarter than I am, of course, said that a lie can make its way around the planet before the truth can tie its shoes. But that's what's going on out there in the universe. And in addition to high tech, we have recently had an operation come to town called the Army Futures Command. They are a significant part of the future of whatever wars we think we need to fight, but on a different level in the economy. In a bit of an expansion to the economy, if Elon Musk brings his Tesla operation to town and sets up an assembly plant out there on the Bastrop Highway somewhere to assemble cyber trucks, that's going to bring a whole different kind of a population to town, but it's also going to create a lot of jobs for a lot of local high school kids who don't necessarily want to or have to go to college and be a big deal lawyer like I think I am. They can be a lot of different things. Now, what happened in this most recent election cycle was a curious, I think, and it's easy for me to say, kind of a tectonic event. I think it was more significant than tectonic. I think it was a tipping point in Travis County. I have listened to my black and brown friends over the years tell me how hard it is to get elected in Travis County. And I can agree with them every day, all day. What happened this last time around is that 2 people named Garza, active, engaged, smart, and I'm telling you, they're going to be qualified, but the plain fact is, about 8 months ago, if you'd asked either one of them where the courthouse is, they might not have been able to take you there. but we've come a long way since then. Delia Garza has been active in the community and she has a dedicated following. Jose Garza, our new DA, is not as traditionally active in the county, but he got the benefit of some significant support, and he and his young people went to work on that social media campaigning, which is different than I grew up with around here with Lyndon Johnson. Whole different kind of campaign. And then it was a unique experience for me to see Bernie Sanders reach down and endorse Jose Garza, for Elizabeth Warren to reach down and endorse Jose Garza, and then the Castro brothers from San Antonio. All of those are smart, competent, experienced politicians, and they all had a significant constituency. And that constituency, folks, turned out. Gaylord and my old acquaintance, Margaret Moore, never really saw it coming. But the people under 40 who are probably not older residents in Travis County than the last 10 years, and a lot of them may not have been around here for 5 years, but they have been following Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and the Castro brothers, and there were significant concerns about some policies within our current DA's office. The Me Too movement and Time's Up activities needed to be heard, and they needed to be accepted as legitimate people trying to protect themselves and do the right thing. And I believe that all of those influences moved forward to get us an upheaval in the politicians who are now going to be occupying the DA's office and the county attorney's office. And that's not a criticism. I'm just telling you that's what the facts are. Both Delia Garza and Jose Garza have a significant learning curve ahead of them to kind of get their feet in the stirrups to figure out what the criminal justice process is in Travis County. They're going to get to introduce themselves to a lot of local police chiefs and the sheriff's office and the Department of Public Safety, the Texas Rangers, and their counterparts all around the state. Jose is going to get to introduce himself to the District and County Attorneys Association, as is Delia, and they're going to start figuring out who the players are and what the program is, and they clearly have qualified abilities to communicate with the media, radio, television, and social media. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out and how they do their jobs and how we actually reimagine criminal justice in Travis County. I was concerned to see just last week that a group, and some of you may belong to it, called the Greater Austin Crime Commission, is concerned about whether or not we're going to be putting enough boots on the ground and law enforcement uniforms in the near future, or how the budgets are going to treat law enforcement. While on the other hand, the Justice Coalition is saying we need to reallocate those resources to mental health issues, homeless issues, and recovery issues for people who need recovery. Well, what I didn't see in some of that reporting, folks, is that they're talking to each other. And I don't get that, but that's just Meissner. That's how old and ignorant I am. If you want to solve a problem, maybe you ought to be talking to the people who think there's a problem. So we'll see how that plays out, and I'm going to keep on managing other people's drama as long as I can. And I'm prepared to answer any of your questions. You've been very patient and let me run on here, probably past my invitation.
Well, let me thank you for that wonderful presentation. We'll open the floor for questions. And Gaylord, I think I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, Wayne, I've never heard our law enforcement and justice system explained more thoroughly or better or more understandably, and thank you. if you'd wipe off your crystal ball a little bit, as you would, what do you foresee the future as it relates to the unrest reflected by the riots, by the marches, protests, and when you look at our county commissioners court, when you look at our city council, our police department, as well as critical new prosecutors you've discussed at some length, what do you see a calming of the waters, if I could just put it generally like that? Or will we, because of all the things that you mentioned, will we continue to be faced with a great deal of consternation, sometimes reflected by the marches and other chaos?
Gaylord, we have not seen times like this, so it's hard to have a baseline of experience to think about moving forward. We've not lived through the kind of depression we're in right now that was intertwined with the kind of health care problems we're having right now with the pandemic, and none of that was taking place in the context of a reaction to what is terrible ongoing racial injustice. And when you add just the gender issues on top of that, I think people are reaching out to try to make some sense of it all in the context, again, of the chaos in the country, whether you accept that it was stirred up by or created by or mismanaged by the government, or whether or not too many people are getting paid too much money to stay home and not work, or the economy is really in good shape. We've got so many different issues floating around right now that people can't even agree on. You ask somebody what time it is and you're liable to get popped in the nose. So I think that some of these expressions of concern about equal treatment under the law and liberty and justice for all, and those are just broad brush concepts, of course. I think they're going to continue in some form until sometime in November, when we finally figure out whether or not this is going to continue with the same administration, or we're going to switch gears and go in a different direction. And then my expectation is probably by Thanksgiving and certainly by Christmas, people are going to start to get back into their own mode of trying to live and survive in the economy and in the pandemic. That's my $2 view of the near future.
If we could have another question, Mac, I believe you sent me a chat.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about defund the police, and you kind of alluded to it when you said reallocating funds. I wonder, what does reallocating, what do you think would be, or do you have thoughts about an appropriate reallocation of funds and responsibilities for the police that would give us a more a better relationship with the community and social justice?
When I said earlier that it seems to me, from my experience, that the people who think there's a problem ought to be talking to each other. I haven't had a lot of luck just doing a lot of finger pointing and name calling and eye gouging and hair pulling over the years to solve any problems. But I know that we have limited resources, and y'all know that they're even more limited because of the economic turmoil of the pandemic. There are no taxes being generated. And that's a broad brush. Just like you say, defund the police, I say there's no money. There's no need to worry about defunding the police because we don't have money to, perhaps in the next budget cycle or after that, to pay anybody. However, nobody is going to defund the police. That was just one of those slogans that got pitched out there that gets people beat over the head with, and it was a misdirection that never should have happened. Any more than perhaps we should have used the word collusion to try to figure out what happened between the Russians and the Trump campaign. It just got carried forward, and people were beating each other over the head with the word collusion. Now they're slapping each other around with defund the police. The police are not going to be defunded. You and I are going to be interested in good law enforcement moving forward, but we are going to have an opportunity to have that conversation on what people think is the best way to use the limited resources we have to support what we traditionally think of as protecting and serving the community. I don't know how that's going to shape up in line by line budget in the near future, but I can tell you my perception is it's going to be talked about, and it's not going to go away with the morning dew.
Roberto, I believe you had a question.
Yes, I was in the grand jury in 1968, 67, somewhere in there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Very.
Yes, Roberto.
I was in the grand jury in 1968. I was one of the grand jury. Did you hear that?
Yes.
You were in the grand jury in 1968, and what happened?
Well, my experience was that when they would bring a young college kids that had been caught with drugs, the district attorney pretty much says, well, you know, he's never had any problems, so we need to not no bill him or her. If he was a minority, a black guy, or well, he has 2 or 3 records, so we need to, you know, bill him. We need to indict him. So I saw that injustice. We're trying to correct that. Now, I agree that there are people in there that are going to instigate from the far right and far left, both radicals. They're trying to get that. But most of the young people right now are saying, no, let's do it right. Let's do it peacefully too, if we can. So I'm hoping for that. And my question is, can you relate to that experience in those days, that was that injustice? When a minority came in, he already had record. When a young people that was in school or in college, no record, no more records.
Well, I should invite you to make this speech. You're doing better than I did. But of course, there are things that happen that you and I wouldn't agree with. But that's what keeps me busy every day, all day, and all of the other defense lawyers that I work with. We're up here, truthfully, of 100% of all of the cases that are filed. About 97% of those cases that are actually presented to a court end up in some resolution, either by dismissal because somebody accepts responsibility in a companion case, or the citizen accepts some probation or some other resolution, and in a lot of cases, they plead, and y'all have heard all of the criticism of the plea bargaining process. If we didn't have a plea bargaining process where we'd like to think all of us big deal professionals can talk to each other and respect each other's judgment and experience, if we didn't have a plea bargaining process, you couldn't spend enough money to provide all the resources for everybody to have a jury trial all the time. That is just unrealistic, and it has devolved or perhaps even ascended. You know, pick your adjective. It has generated the plea bargaining process where my clients, people I work with, they get to decide what's in their best interest. I can tell them every day, all day, here is your $40 chance at X, Y, and Z, but this is your life. I'm going to go home and tend to my family when this is over with, and you're going to have to live with the consequences of what you did if you believe that you did it. If you don't believe you did something wrong, this really is America, and you get to have a jury trial. But 97% of those cases end up with some resolution. And of the remaining 3%, traditionally only about 10% of those cases went to a jury trial. And there are varying statistics on how many of those cases ended up with acquittals, reduction in conviction, or sure enough, straight up conviction and somebody gets to go to prison. Let me just say that it can generate an entire different Lions Club meeting to talk about the Texas jail and prison system and the federal prison system. That's an entire different program.
Thank you.
Susan, I think you have a question. Susan? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I have a comment.
Okay, any other questions?
There's somebody, I think.
Rudy?
I do.
Okay, Norman. Norman, thank you for waiting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meissner. I really appreciate the presentation. It's wonderful to be able to listen to someone with your experience and your background. And I was just wondering, I feel a sense of confusion today, maybe like many do, with regard to the court system. And you've helped clarify a lot of what we, maybe misunderstandings we might have. But one of the things that keeps going through my mind is I feel like I've always heard this idea of the court system itself is overlogged. It's backed up. There are too many cases waiting to be resolved. And I'm wondering, first, is that the case, at least in Travis County? And if there is a backlog, or if there isn't, what kind of propositions can you make with your experience to say we can make it better by doing this, this, and this?
Well, let me tell you about that, because it generally starts with law enforcement, and the curse that they live under is they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And if we think we've got a backlog, it's because they take a lot of people to jail. And there has been some criticism about that process from the very front end of the program. Do the police have to arrest everybody that they think may be misbehaving? Y'all have seen the evolution of the cite and release program here in Central Texas and around the state and around the country for various transgressions that people generally don't get terribly excited about, like maybe they used to. Somebody, mostly these young kids fooling around with marijuana, they give them a ticket and tell them to show up at the courthouse so they don't have to go to jail. Now the justices of the peace, and primarily the JP number 5 at the courthouse, has a program where they can go through a deferred disposition program if they'll go take an alcohol and drug recovery program and awareness program, and maybe do 50 hours of work at Meals on Wheels or Goodwill or Austin Recovery or something. They can dismiss those cases. That is also sort of moving through some of the minor shoplifting cases. But the reason that there are a lot of cases at the courthouse is because we have a big population and we have a lot of law enforcement folks who are putting a lot of people in jail. And we have a limited number of courts that are processing those cases. And as I said somewhere along in this speech, the citizens kind of get the criminal justice system they're willing to pay for. And pay for is always a problem. That has to go generally for all of our courts, they have to get legislative approval. So you've got to have one or more of our legislative delegation sponsoring a bill to create a new court. You see that we're building a super duper courthouse down here at 17th and 18th on Guadalupe. That's going to have the capacity for, I'm told, 25 different courtrooms.
Wow.
We don't have that many judges in Travis County right now, but somebody thinks in the future we're going to. I'm not sure that that's true, but we're going to continue processing cases in the criminal courts just as fast as we can move them through. And unfortunately, so many people who are arrested these days do not have the family history and connection to pay the money to get out of jail. And I guess it is just a fact of life, and it is a terrible fact of life that if you ever get in trouble once, sometimes that follows you and people think you're a bad actor. Next time something happens and they just keep recycling through the system and they stay in jail and they can't get out of jail. And it really is kind of a wreck. But we have developed in Travis County the ability to try to redirect so many of those folks who have other issues like mental health, to get them some services and try to get them to a place. Now, you understand that that means that we've got maybe too many people, but that creates a whole different bucket of arguments about whether or not we need to worry about terminating pregnancies.
Mr. Meissner, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're running short on time. But I want to thank you very much for your presentation and ask you, would you be willing to stay a few minutes after we adjourn the meeting to answer additional questions?
I'll be happy to stay as long as Gaylord's paying me.
Time's up.
So I'm
Sorry, time's up.
happy to stay after adjournment.
All right, let me bring the meeting to closure. But before I do that, I received a chat of something I neglected to do earlier, and that is to ask if we have any guests or visitors so that we may introduce you. Do we, if you will wave your hand.
We do have two guests. We have Kit Thompson and Susie Gallagher, friends of ours.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And Chuck, thank you for inviting them. We've had a wonderful program and a wonderful meeting. Any other guests that we might want to recognize?
Rudy,
Gaylord? Yes.
I hope, as nobody knows better than Mark Hastings, that I'm still of the Big Chief Tablet #2, and so I tried to include a person that Wayne mentioned as a dear friend of his and mine that's probably done more for Austin and Central Texas and economic development than anybody. And he's done everything from being chairman of the Austin Chamber to help, as Wayne said, bring MCC, Sematech. He's been Mr. Economic Development, but I've tried to include Mr. Pike Powers to observe Wayne's comments today. They're not only dear friends, but spend a lot of time together, and I hope Pike had made it, but I just wanted y'all to know that somebody as distinguished as Wayne and Pike were interested in the Lions Club and interested in this program, and I hope I was able to include Pike.
Well, thank you very much for extending that invitation. And so we have one more part.
Rudy, let me just say,
Yeah.
Gaylord, I am so glad that you tried to invite Pike. I didn't see him on here, so I'm not sure he made it. But let me say to you and to all others is that the invitations that you receive one on Tuesday, usually one on Friday, and then one on Tuesday. You're certainly welcome to forward that invitation to anybody you think would be interested in the program, and the link will work for anybody. So if you'd like someone to join us at our meeting as a visitor, Rudy, you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think everybody's invited to join this meeting.
No, you're certainly correct. We invite everyone that is able to join us and see a little bit more about what our Lions Club is about.
And you don't need a Big Chief tablet.
Yeah. Let me have Fred Jenga take a moment to introduce or to tell us about next week's program. Fred? Fred, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Good, good, good. Yeah, I'm down in California in Berkeley. So next week we're staying with the theme of social justice, and we have a very good speaker, Dr. Gay Lang, who is the Texas-wide Director of Restorative Practices. And she's going to share with us about something that is, I think, a challenge about students of color and suspensions and expulsions, that they seem to experience that more in school. And she will share with us about alternative options that people can use to address disciplinary issues among African American and students of color, especially in schools. So it's going to be exciting. She's been doing this for almost 20 years.
So, well, thank you very much. We look forward to the program. Again, our thanks to Mr. Meissner for his wonderful presentation, and he's agreed to stay a few minutes after we adjourn, and so we'll adjourn at this time. So I thank you everyone for coming, and the meeting is adjourned.
Okay, Kit, I guess, who's in charge?
Chuck, if you will.
Okay, I have an interesting note. You noticed all these people coming out of the military. I had a cousin who was a lawyer, he passed away, may he rest in peace. He called it the uninformed code of military justice, not the uniform code of military justice. Now let me hang on the back of this. I am a retired Army officer, so I'm not anti-military. Okay. Did you hear me?
We didn't hear the question.
Question, I just note that when you talked about all these policemen coming from the military into the civilian police force, they were under a different system. And I look at these guys and I think, gee, they look like the guys I served with in Vietnam. They don't look like police officers.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
That wasn't necessarily a directed criticism. It's just a fact of life that military people are trained differently to focus on enemies. And there's a perception in the community that if the local law enforcement is significantly populated by former military people, they think of the local population as being the enemy that they have to interface with. And that's not to say that all of them are doing that the same way. It just is a perception issue. And it is sort of heightened, I think, and exaggerated in some circumstances when you get to see people in their military gear that look like they're ready for war on our local streets. That creates a problem that people have to talk about.
I think that's one of the biggest things they have to do in whatever they do to reform the police, is to get them back in the idea that their idea is the service to the public is not their enemy.
And you see where the issue is kind of joined, and we have to have those kind of conversations so that the local citizenry does not feel like they're under assault or under attack from a military force, instead of a force that they traditionally think of as there to protect and serve and to deter people from committing crime, as well as to try to help people solve issues that are out there in the neighborhood. It is a perception issue, but of course, some of those perception issues are driven by education and training and communication. And if we don't take the time and spend the money to educate both sides, then each side, the law enforcement folks are out there in their training facility. The community is downtown doing what they do. If they don't interact with each other in some meaningful way, there's going to be a little bit of ongoing suspicion about who the players are and what the program is and where do I fit into it and how safe am I going to be.
Meissner, I have a question about the painting behind you. Would you talk about that?
Yes, many years ago, I had a client who I helped to navigate through the courthouse. And he had this painting that was if y'all can see it, is kind of an evening preparation for the evening meal, having a prayer session around the wagon trains gathered there. And he had a portfolio of pictures and paintings, and he said, I don't have a whole lot of money, but I have been given some of these pictures, and would you take one? And I said, I'm happy to take that one, and I've had it, I think, for about 45 years.
Very nice.
Just one, this is Gaylord, and one thing that I experienced that we all observe that stresses points Wayne has made about how our legal system has changed and how law enforcement has had to adapt, and even how it's affected who's elected to office. And that is when the popularity of marijuana, particularly by young people, and the use of marijuana was at its peak in the early 70s. I remember well, in 1973, the legislature passing the law that any possession of marijuana would result in a felony offense and you go straight to jail. As Wayne mentioned today, you pick up for possession and they'll give you a slip that you usually can work off, as Wayne explained, through some type of community service. And Wayne has had to adjust as a practitioner from prosecutor to representing people with every kind of offense in the world, and has seen those changes, but the effect it's had on law enforcement, how they react, on our judicial system, as well as sometimes elections, been amazing. And I'll tell you what, that felony offense bill passed in 73, if anybody tried to get in the way, they would have been run over and hurt badly. And that just is a little example of how much change has occurred in our values and but also in our law enforcement and judicial system.
Comment? Do I just talk?
Yes.
All right. My name is Gloria. Thank you very much, Mr. Meissner, for your presentation. I wanted to say that I do agree with you in that the police should not be defunded. I think, in my personal opinion, that perhaps they should have more compassionate training, that they are too quick on drawing the gun and have this machismo attitude. I can give you a quick example that happened over 30 years ago to my brother. The police arrived at his house, his wife answered, and they said they wanted my brother for arrest for something or the other. And she said, no, it's a mistake. No. They yanked the screen door open, took out the gun. By this time, my brother came in and they put the handcuffs on him and took him away. The children were crying. And well, an hour later, my brother calls and says, come get me, they made a mistake. So when my sister-in-law got to the office, she was told, well, here he is, you can take him home. And so she said, you made a mistake. They said nothing. And she said, aren't you going to apologize? They said nothing. It's this attitude of they're the law and they don't, there's just no compassion. And I think that perhaps a little bit more time spent on not being so quick to draw the gun. But I do agree that they should not be defunded, but rather that the training perhaps should be a little more compassionate. That's my opinion.
Well, I appreciate it. And if you let
I
me
can't hear.
expand on that just a touch, it continues to be true, I believe, that if somebody really acknowledges that they made a mistake, that can help cure a whole lot of pain. And it really is a simple formula. And you see that our young people are learning too much on TV from all of the politicians who try to say they're sorry without saying they're sorry. And they don't want to acknowledge any wrongdoing, but think they are. It really is simple to say, I am so sorry for what I did. Would you please forgive me? And I promise to never do it again if I can keep from it. It doesn't need to be had. But it's hard to do that, and it's hard to get people to do it in so many different circumstances. But the circumstance you suggested is it would have been a whole lot easier for your family to accept that maybe they did understand that they made a mistake if they'd have just put your brother back in the same car and taken him right back to the same place where they arrested him. Why in the name of heaven couldn't that be done and say, you're right? Well, part of it is because of so many of my brothers and sisters in the trial practice who will sue you for making a mistake. And if we can get past some of that, perhaps litigation issue, and it doesn't always have to happen, but sometimes there really are cases where somebody should pay some money for what they did. When the police misbehave, you and I as taxpayers get to pay a lot of money to correct their mistakes. That's just a fact of life. I don't know about the sensitivity training. I sometimes think that from time to time, I would like to have a conversation with the spouses and significant others of so many of our law enforcement folks, just to ask them, what do you make of the life you're living with your partner's chosen profession? What do you make of it? Because painfully, when some of those law enforcement guys misbehave and they get arrested and put in jail and sometimes sent to prison, there are a lot of other victims. Their very own family is victimized for something that they didn't ask for, and in so many cases they cannot prevent. I don't know many wives or husbands who sent their law enforcement folks out in the field and say, go out there and kick somebody's ass for me. That doesn't happen. But there are consequences for misbehaving. One of the good things that I've seen over the years, of course, as I said about women getting into the legal profession, there are more and more women and minorities getting involved in law enforcement. And I don't say minorities unkindly, for goodness sakes. We are all children of the same God. We just may call him by a different name and blah, blah. Y'all didn't ask for my lecture or my pastoral preaching for today, but you're right. Maybe if we got along a little bit better, there'd be fewer and fewer bad experiences.
Well, with that, Mr. Meissner, Mac, you want to ask the last question? I'm afraid we're going to have to go. Go ahead, Mac.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to comment on Gloria's experience with her brother getting wrongfully arrested, and maybe the reason that she didn't get an apology is because that would have meant the police admitted wrongdoing and opened him up for liability. And I wonder what Mr. Meissner has to say about that, and whether there's some way. I mean, they should be able, you know, there should be some compensation method for making mistakes like that, and a way for the police to apologize and not open themselves up for liability so much.
Well, I agree there ought to be some mechanism, and I don't think the way to address that is that the false arrest and you get 2 free speeding tickets. But there ought to be You're right. And my experience has been generally in other fields, when doctors have a little bit of a problem in treating people, if they just say, I'm sorry, it looked to me like this is what we needed to do. Here's what we did. It didn't turn out so good, and I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I'll try to fix it. Tell me what I can do to fix it. If you try to fix it, it is so much less likely that anybody's going to walk right out of your office and pick up their cell phone and call a lawyer. And so if the law enforcement guys would say, all right, we mucked up, we thought we were doing the right thing, we're going to give you a ride back home, and I don't know what we can do for you, but call us if we can ever help you, and we'll try to do the right thing, and we're real sorry. That generally will give that person a pretty good line of stories to tell to their family at the next reunion, but they're not likely to go call a lawyer. And so many times I can tell you from experience that lawyers are oftentimes going to say, here's the issue you're presenting. This looks like it's going to take X amount of your life to deal with it. And it appears from the damages you're telling me about that you got handcuffs put on you, you were embarrassed in front of your family, and you got to ride uptown, and then you got to ride right back home. I don't know that after we spend $150,000 worth of time worrying about it, that you're going to collect $15. Do you really want me to do this? On a whole different level. Gaylord's probably heard me tell this story more often than I ought to, but many years ago, it was told to me to be the truth that Lyndon Johnson had an article printed about him in the New York Times, and they suggested that he might be a racist. And that hurt his feelings. And he called in his good friend Abe Fortas, who was subsequently appointed to the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson. But Abe Fortas was in private practice in those days. And Lyndon called him into his office as Senate Majority Leader. And he said, Abe, I want to sue the New York Times for libel and slander. And Abe said, well, Mr. Majority Leader, maybe we ought to do that, but let me just ask you a couple of questions first. How many people down in Texas you think read the New York Times? And in those days, in the early 60s, he said, well, maybe 50,000 people. He said, and how many of those people you think read the New York Times and read that story about you being a racist, either didn't vote for you the last time or they're not going to vote for you the next time? And he said, well, maybe 5,000. He said, all right, 5,000 people might be affected by that article, but Mr. Majority Leader, if you sue the New York Times, 5 million people are going to read that story, and they're going to be real sure that you're a racist. Now, I'll do that if you want me to, but maybe you ought to think about it for a day or two. And I think we can all do that. And I guess the idea is that there's some reason for that old notion of taking a deep breath and count to 10 and get over yourself. How much more of your time and energy and treasure do you want to invest, maybe to prove that you're right, and maybe other people will think that you're a fool? There you have it.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Meissner, if Gaylord's bankroll will support this, we'd like to have you back sometime. So we'll
I'm happy to accommodate you whenever I can, and you know that I don't mind telling you a few stories.
I'm afraid we're having a board of directors meeting that's going to overlap what we've already enjoyed. So I'm afraid we're going to have to close time now. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
We'll sign off here.
Yes, thank you. And those that are staying for the Board of Directors meeting, would you just take a couple of minutes